Good afternoon. I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Today's conversation is inspired by our film, The Chinese Exclusion Act, which examines the origin, history, and impact of the 1882 law that made it illegal for Chinese workers to come to America and illegal for Chinese nationals already here to ever become US citizens. The first in a long line of racist acts targeting the Chinese, it remains in force for more than 60 years. On this day, many Americans across the country are coming together to question the structures and circumstances that allow for racial violence and discrimination in this country. Our discussion, presented in partnership with the Center for Asian American Media and the World's Channel, will examine the origins of discrimination against Asians in America, the subsequent rise of anti-Asian sentiment that persists to this day, and offer some thoughts on the role we all can play in ending racial violence and discrimination. This is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions for our panelists and moderator in the chat box. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Consumer Cellular. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, David Ho and the Liu Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now it is my privilege to introduce our panelists and moderator for this conversation. Hoon Lee is an award-winning American stage and screen actor who served as the narrator in the film, The Chinese Exclusion Act. His Broadway credits include Flower Drum Song, Urinetown, Pacific Overtures, and the title role in the Lincoln Center revival of The King and I. More recently, he played Wang Chao, a wily fixer on HBO Max's Warrior, a critically recognized show originally conceived by Bruce Lee. His latest role is as Toad on Apple's futuristic show, See. Li Xin-yu is a New York-based filmmaker, editor, and the co-director of the Chinese Exclusion Act. A longtime collaborator of Rick Burns, their current film, Oliver Sacks' His Own Life, is a critic's choice on the festival and theatrical circuit. Li Xin will be collaborating with us here at American Experience on another special project, so stay tuned for more on that. Erika Lee is an award-winning historian and author, Regents Professor of History and Asian American Studies, and Director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. She's the author of 4 award-winning books, including most recently, The Making of Asian America and America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in America. He is vice president of the Organization of American Historians and directs 3 major digital humanities projects, Immigrant Stories, #Immigration Syllabus, and Immigrants in COVID America. And finally, our moderator, Stephen Gong, is the executive director of the Center for Asian American Media, also known as CAM, a public media and cultural nonprofit organization located in San Francisco. He has been a lecturer in the Asian American Studies program at UC Berkeley, where he developed and taught a course on the history of Asian American media. In addition to writing about film history, Gong has provided critical commentary on several DVD projects, including The Treasures from American Archives, Volumes 1 and 5, and Chan is Missing. Stephen, I'll let you take it from here.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation about the roots of anti-Asian hate in America. This has been a trying time, and I know that many of you are here seeking more information and a greater understanding about what's happening in our world. And because you're followers of American experience or public media, I know many of you also love and want to share and hear from those who make our stories that can illuminate and give us a greater sense and a greater understanding of just what's happening in our world. As Cameo said, our conversation is inspired by the Chinese Exclusion Act, the history of which explains a lot about where anti-Asian sentiment began and how it's proliferated in the United States over these last 150 years. How do we make sense of this? Is the current racial situation and hatred towards Asian Americans something that we're seeing because of the pandemic? Sadly, we can tell you no. It goes back much deeper. It's been part of the American fabric probably since its founding, and for Asian Americans for 150 years. So to begin with, and to perhaps center the conversation in storytelling, let's take a look at this first of our clips from the Chinese Exclusion Act documentary.
The solitary arm of the unfinished Statue of Liberty had languished on Madison Square in New York for more than 5 years, when on May 6, 1882, on the eve of the greatest wave of immigration in American history, President Chester A. Arthur signed into law an extraordinary piece of federal legislation. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was unlike any law enacted since the founding of the Republic. Singling out as never before a specific race and nationality for exclusion, it made it illegal for Chinese workers to come to America, and for Chinese nationals already here ever to become citizens of the United States. Fueled by deep-seated tensions over race and class and national identity that had been festering since the founding of the Republic, it was the first in a long line of acts targeting the Chinese for exclusion, and it would remain in force for more than 60 years. It continues to shape the debate about what it means to be an American to this day.
History is always about interpretation. Who's telling the stories of not only our collective history, but about marginalized communities who are part of our national story. And what was so important about the Chinese Exclusion Act program is that so much of the creative team were Chinese and Asian American. Li Xin Yu, as the co-director, producer, and editor of this film, what are your thoughts about revisiting this piece? Does this story mean something different today to you than when you finished it?
Well, we started it quite in 2013 was when it was first suggested to us whether if we want to join in an effort with the New York Historical Society exhibition, and it became a no-brainer. And as we got into researching and the detail of the history, it was as if history was happening outside our window. Things were heating up in Arizona. The idea of needing carrying identification. I was just like, well, that is part of the Chinese Exclusion Act. When it was renewed by the Gary Act, Chinese and only the Chinese had to carry identification passport. If you're caught without it, you could be deported. And so at the time I was feeling this is, we have to know this history. We have to learn this history so that we don't repeat it. But I think now over time and as events keep evolving and churning in our country to today, I sometimes I think, well, that's slightly wrong way to look about it, because we have to understand that this has always been who we are, in a way, the way other people who look different, the way we stigmatize, the way we finger point and blame anytime anything comes up that we have anxiety about, like our current, COVID situation. So how do we understand all of that, and then understand what steps we need to take to move forward to create a space that is more equitable and just for all of us? So it's maybe not a huge shift, but kind of the understanding of who tells the story, I think, is hugely important. Because if we don't tell the story, then it's going to be told about us, and it's going to be framed in a different way that doesn't include our voices in a truer way. I think, Erika and whom probably have greater things to say about on that front, just in terms of stories that is represented.
Yes. Actually, you're mentioning the telling and voice, and I did want to ask Hoon, as the voice that leads us through this entire story, and you're, the life of a creative person as an actor, and you've played many different kinds of roles that tell different parts of the Asian American experience. How is it for you to sort of think about the meaning of the film and the history that you shared with all of us in telling the story of the Chinese Exclusion Act?
Well, the timing of it was extraordinary because I had been working on, or just started work on, Warrior, which was this sort of heightened, fictionalized account of the Tong Wars in San Francisco at the end of the 19th century. And right at that time, I was asked to narrate the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it was a hugely informative event because as I'm reading this, beautifully researched script, I caught myself at several points because I was processing what I was reading sort of for the first time. And I was somewhat taken aback by the well of emotion that sort of comes up from recognizing A, what has happened, and B, how little you know of it, as somebody who's intimately involved through heredity and citizenship. You're involved as an Asian American, you're involved as an American. And it was a real pointed lesson. I would say it's arguably one of the jobs that's had the most impact in my life because it's changed my awareness. It's changed my self-awareness and my understanding of who I am and what I know. And I thought to myself, if this can be done for me, it can be done for other people, which is the hopeful part of it, right? That's the intent. So in narrating it, it became more and more an endeavor to use myself as a model to figure out what are the things that are affecting me, what are the things that I can hear, that I can really hear, and also what are the things that are difficult to hear, or what are the things that are difficult to process, so that moving forward I could say, well, bringing this subject matter to the table, there might be obstacles to being heard, and that has been really valuable as well, just to sort of take the insider view with me as the piece itself goes out into public.
Thank you, Hoon. And Erika, as one of our foremost historians and a featured historian in Chinese Exclusion Act, I wonder if you can share with us, maybe if it's only briefly, given the vast amount of information I know you must have on this, sort of what's your first initial thought in revisiting this material and being one who is continually trying to understand and interpret the meaning of American history, the way that, Chinese American history is American history, and what part, as we lay out the initial part of this story, what comes to your mind as you now revisit this material?
Yeah, thank you for that great question. As a historian, I'm supposed to be fully aware of all of the travesties that we've played in the past, and perhaps be a little bit more prepared to understand what happens during times of crises, but also during times of racial reckoning. But I have to say that even with all of that scholarship and knowledge and historical hindsight, that what we have been facing, not just this year during COVID in 2020 and 2021, but certainly under the former administration that really took our immigration policies right back to the Chinese Exclusion Act era. Of course, the very first, one of the very first immigration actions that President Trump signed was the Muslim ban. And so for many of us, descendants of those who were the first immigrant group to be singled out for exclusion under the Chinese Exclusion Act, that Muslim ban was, not only stung, but it also, I think, was a wake-up call for all of us to realize that those dark days were not over, that American racism was extremely adaptable, and that even as Chinese Americans were seemingly, rising up as quote unquote model minorities, that America found another immigrant group to demonize. Now, of course, during the pandemic, it's been very clear that the model Chinese Americans haven't been so model and so protected after all. And so thinking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but also just the rampant racism and the legalization of racism and xenophobia during the late 19th century has certainly resonated with us today in these very tragic times. And certainly, I hope, is a call for action and a call for us not to be complicit in continuing to think about social justice and equity.
Thank you, Erika. And this is something we'll be returning to later in our conversation about, in a sense, what's different today and what we can do today that's that we could not do as a community. I want to set up this next clip, and one of the things that I think was a learning experience for me in helping to work on this film and is how complex this story is of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the way that so many pieces of legislation were passed, and what was the context at that time. And what again we'll see that echoes through history is the interplay of political interests throughout the country, and how demonizing a minority group can be used for political gain. The roots of the Chinese Exclusion Act are very much also coincide with the end of the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, and another time, a different time of racial reckoning, and in a sense, racial reckoning that was not fulfilled. So let's take a look at this next clip from the Chinese Exclusion Act that explains this in some greater detail.
This is the era when all of the promises of the Civil War are going to start falling apart. After the Civil War, we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And those are all civil rights amendments. The 13th abolishes slavery. The 15th gives Black men the right to vote. But the 14th Amendment grants all civil rights to all persons.
On July 9th, 1868, just 3 weeks before the Burlingame Treaty was concluded, the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution was formally adopted. Despite bitter opposition from most states of the fallen Confederacy, which were forced to ratify it to regain representation in Congress. Overruling the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott, which had denied citizenship and all civil rights to Black Americans, the 14th Amendment's Citizenship Clause declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States, who cannot be deprived of life, liberty, due process, civil rights, or equal protection under the law. In the decades to come, the spare 80-word text would form a last slender line of defense for the Chinese in America. As the country began a long, slow descent into an abyss of hatred and violence, directed against all people of color.
February 6th, 1869, Chicago. We warn working men that a new and dangerous foe looms up in the far west. Already our brothers of the Pacific have to meet it. And just as soon as the Pacific Railroad is completed, these Chinamen will begin to swarm through the Rocky Mountains like devouring locusts and spread out over the country this side. Men who can work for $1 a day are a dangerous element in our country. We must not sleep until the foe is upon us, but commence to fight him now. In the name of the working men of our common country, we demand that our government forbid another Chinaman to set foot upon our shores. The Workmen's Advocate.
And so we're seeing the so-called building of the case. The Chinese immigrants need to be limited, banned from coming to the United States. Erika, if you would, not only in your extensive writing, you also testified to Congress last week. So I'd like in this next section, if we could talk a little bit about what's different today as opposed to then. You know, what's happening in the political situation in the United States at the time the Exclusion Act was passed, and in a sense, what recourse does the Chinese American community have in trying to combat this threat to their very participation in the American experiment?
The biggest, let me start with similarities. 1870s, 1880s to not just 2016 to 2020, but for much of the early 20th century and late 20th century, we are debating immigration. It has become a debate over race and citizenship. We have differences in terms of using racism very explicitly in the late 19th century, whereas today there are many who use explicitly racist language, but also there's lots of coded language in terms of illegal immigration or lack of assimilation. But in both periods, the debate of immigration was not just about newcomers coming into the United States. It was really about, and is really about, the kind of nation that we want to be, who is really included in the notion of we the people or Americans, and what does being an American really mean? In the late 19th century, Chinese immigrants were barred by law. All Asian people were barred by law from becoming naturalized citizens. So we had no political power, no power of the vote. The challenges that Chinese Americans undertook to challenge the exclusion laws happened mostly through the courts. If you fast forward to the early 20th century, one of the most notable things that I felt viscerally as I was part of the congressional hearings last week on anti-Asian violence and discrimination was how important it was that first, there were so many Asian American lawmakers, and that second, that there were Asian American staffers in Congress who brought these issues to light, who had done the research, that there are Asian American journalists, that there are Asian American celebrities and scholars and documentary filmmakers and people across the board. That kind of representation simply was not possible for Asian Americans in the late 19th century. And that has made all the difference in terms of making sure that these issues are paid attention to, that there are many voices that can be brought to the table to advocate, and that we can move forward in looking at durable solutions. The congressional hearings that took place last week was only the second time in US history that Congress has ever held hearings on the topic of anti-Asian violence. And we all know, having watched this documentary, that this history goes back 150, 170 years. So just think about that. Just twice in our history has Congress felt it important to address this issue. I hope it's not the last time.
Wow. Well, before we open up to audience questions, I want to spend a few minutes talking about stereotypes that exist about Asian Americans, from the model minority, working hard for little pay, taking jobs from real Americans, to the hypersexualization of Asian women. So let's take a look at this final clip from for today from the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Lawmakers in Congress, for their part, still led by radical Republicans whose principles had been forged in the fight against slavery, continued to resist all efforts to get them to legislate against the Chinese on the basis of their race. But by 1875, the political dynamic in America had begun to shift, as Democrats in Washington began to understand that the Chinese issue could be indispensable to the post-Civil War rehabilitation of the Democratic Party.
The issue of Chinese labor becomes a very easy one to galvanize the constituents of the Democratic Party. Working men in particular, many of whom come from European immigrant backgrounds, would have been working class, would have been concerned about what appeared to be the flooding of Chinese workers into the nation. And that's where we don't have just simply a local story, but one that then has large national resonance.
The Democrats suggest that the Chinese labor were actually equivalent to black slaves. So you had this political pressure against the Republicans who were accused of advocating for Chinese coolies. And so that made it possible for the exclusion movement to get the support from the East Coast politicians.
For the first time, a pathway to Chinese exclusion, stymied at the national level for 20 years, now began to open.
In 1875, Congress passes the Page Act, which is an effort to speak to the demands of the Californians without circumventing the Burlingame Treaty. The Page Act prohibits the immigration of people coming under contracts to work and prostitutes. Now, Chinese have been stereotyped already. All the men are coolies, all the women are prostitutes. So they think this is the way they're going to stop the Chinese immigration.
There developed this sexist, racist, misogynist attitude among Americans that Chinese women were naturally prone to become prostitutes. And therefore, the Chinese women who wanted to come to the U.S. had to prove that they were never prostitutes, that they weren't prostitutes then, nor would they ever become prostitutes. Now, of course, one can't prove what will not happen or happen in the future. So many women chose not to even go through that humiliation. So we have that first act that's passed that is very racial and gender specific.
So after the Page Act came the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Erika, I wonder if you could fill us in a little bit. When did the Chinese Exclusion Act finally end, and what brought about its being nullified?
Well, it lasted for 61 years, and this is where we have to remember that it was initially passed as a temporary measure. It was really only supposed to be targeted, and it would last for 10 years. And lo and behold, once you close the door, it's much harder to open it back up again. So the Exclusion Act was renewed and then eventually made permanent. By the 1930s, all other Asians seeking to enter the United States, including Filipinos and South Asians, Japanese, Koreans, they were also barred from entry. Exclusion Act officially is repealed in 1943. It's part of a wartime measure because we are allies with China in the war against Japan. But this absolutely does not mean that we are opening up America to all Chinese who want to come. We do allow Chinese to become naturalized citizens, so that is extremely important. But Chinese immigration is placed on a national origins quota system that had been put in place in the 1920s. And the quota for China is 105 people per year. So in fact, the repeal and the immigration that happens after 1943 is in many ways more restrictive than what was happening before that time. It's really not until 1965 that we have more Chinese, more Asian, more immigration from Latin America and Africa. And we have seen how that's transformed the country. But exclusion's legacy just continues to this day.
Thank you, Erika. You know, I think all of us in the audience can also appreciate that certainly the immigration reform actions in the mid-1960s have indeed transformed America. And in some ways, you know, a lot of the issues that we face as a whole nation today are reckoning with that shift in America's demographics. Li Xin and Hoon, I want to ask you as creative people who tell these stories, but also as people whose families, in a sense, immigrated, you know, later on in the story. My own family story dates back actually to Gold Rush Chinese in the mid 19th century. But Li Xin, I want to start with you. You know, sort of what was how did your personal connections to this story in your families, did it shift during the making of this film as you come to understand in a greater way, you know, what the mechanism of exclusion came about?
Well, you know, I am first generation. So I am here because of the 1965 shift. You know, I was able to come because I was, you know, family. My aunt was here already. So my aunt brought my grandmother, and since my grandmother was here, I was able to come. And, you know, I think for me as a young person, not having grown up here, and not that if I had grown up here, I would have known this history, because this history is not taught. But I think for me, one catalyzing event was in the 80s during the Vincent Chin case. That was when I had just become a citizen, and just suddenly had to question, well, do I belong? Am I wanted? It doesn't seem that way. So it's very confusing. And I think for newer immigrants, you know, if you don't know this long history and how laws were enacted to finger point you, it can be very confusing and very destabilizing, and you question yourself rather than being able to be forefront about, no, this is the truth, and it is not that I am to be blamed. So I think learning this history in greater detail definitely helped me understand, well, we all have a place here. We all make this country the way it is. And, you know, especially seeing how Chinese throughout time fought back, you know, decades after decades, from the very beginning through now. And because at the time we had no vote, but we understood we could use the courts. We had our rights, and we did use it. And so that is a huge learning lesson, inspiring lesson for us to understand now that there, you know, even in these dark days, there is a path forward. We just need to understand the trajectory, the reasoning, the history, so that, you know, be informed so you understand how to move forward.
Thank you, Li Xin. And Hoon, as an actor, it is your profession, your life's work is to, in some ways, inhabit types, confront, and know that you're working kind of with expectations about typing, but investing it, very much with a real life, with a fuller depiction and representation. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing your Korean American, if I understand correctly, and how your family came here and your own personal decisions to enter this creative field, which is so difficult for an Asian American to work in.
Yeah, my parents came over for educational purposes, and they were both research scientists. My brother is a scientist as well. So naturally, I'm an actor because, yeah, that makes sense. But I think that in going into acting as a profession that really spoke to me, it speaks to a larger issue about questions of assimilation in general, because what you end up doing is sort of accepting the rules of the game. And you adopt an attitude that it's your responsibility to overcome the racism that's put in front of you, the sort of disregard, the cliche and the stereotype. It's your job to do that. You have to prove that these people may be mistaken in their attitude. And you somewhat blindly accept that, I think particularly as the son of immigrants, because I think my parents were operating under similar sort of expectations and understanding of the rules. You assume that as well. And it becomes just the nature of your strategy going forward. And what plays into that so strongly is a lack of awareness about history does two things. One, it robs you of the sense of what the problem might be, how nuanced it actually is. And that it also robs you of the moments of triumph that exist there as well, as Li-Shin was referring to. The idea that so many of the challenges to the Exclusion Act were legal battles that were won. That sort of thing is incredibly inspirational. It's very empowering to know that, hey, this is not a new battle. It's a battle that we have fought, we will continue to fight, and we can win. We can do that. When I apply that to something like acting or dramatic narrative, I'm empowered by that because I think to myself, hey, I may not see the representation that I want to see yet, but it doesn't mean it's not coming. It doesn't mean I can't help that come to being. But I think that understanding what the specific nature of the challenge is, the real specific nature of the challenge, not the sort of black and white simplified version of the challenge, which can often lead you down a completely different path and actually make a lot of assumptions about what you're even supposed to be fighting. I think that particular aspect of it is hugely helped by understanding the history of how this struggle has been fought over many, many years.
Thank you very much. So Erika, I wonder if now that we're thinking about the lessons of history and you're being an educator, and was mentioned before, the Chinese Exclusion Act, to my knowledge, was never taught in any school. Do you see a greater interest, a greater appetite, or maybe just expressed as a greater need for somehow this story to be told and taught to all Americans?
I'm sorry to say that over many years teaching, and the arrival of new books and new documentary films and television shows, etc., I'm sorry to say that my students, when they first come into my classes, still have such a lack of knowledge about Asian American history. They consistently say year after year, I never knew that this happened. And it's not just my students here at the University of Minnesota, it's anytime I speak to a large public audience, to be frank, around the country. Very educated audiences at Ivy League universities, public audiences at libraries, etc. It's quite disappointing, to be honest, because I remember feeling that way when I was a college student many years ago, and there weren't as many books and films and lawmakers, et cetera. But now it feels like there's a willful, there's something willful about the lack of attention, that Asian American history is either seen as not important enough or something that's important only when you have time. It's an add-on when there's an extra day or a week. And that is first of all, it's just wrong. It's also quite disastrous, frankly, because when we see something like what happened, the tragedy that happened last week in Atlanta, we realize that when there's such a lack of understanding or knowledge about Asian Americans in the United States, struggles, hardships, racialization as victims of discrimination, as victims of sexual violence, then it is so easy for so many to dismiss these horrific hate incidents as isolated crimes by deranged individuals, rather than as one more example of our nation's systemic racism that does impact Asian Americans. I feel that, of course, there's so much that we can do, from new laws, but especially as an educator, one of the first things that we need to do is to make sure that this content, these lessons, these stories are being shared and told and preserved at every level of education, not just at the college level, because by that time it's almost too late. So we really need to reinvest in our K12 schools in order to teach anti-racism at an early age and across the great diversity of our American experiences.
Can I jump in for a second? I just want to say, Erika's book, American for Americans, one thing I really am enjoying about it and appreciating about it is that it contextualizes racism within a larger idea of xenophobia. And in that way, I think it very clearly draws the connection between all forms of discrimination, all forms of racism, all forms of bias and bigotry. And that's one of those connections that I think is really important in sort of diminishing the sort of, or it fights against using specificity of a racial experience to ignore it, to categorize it or subordinate it as not important, not big enough, etc. It's a reminder to us, too, that our allyship to other people who are experiencing discrimination is extremely important because it is part of our struggle as well. And that these things are all essentially one idea that have many, many branches. And if we fall into this trap of getting too concerned with the specificity of our particular experience and ignoring all the commonalities that cut across the board, then we're actually playing into the hands of those that would hold that against us, right? Because then you're looking at a bunch of different directions, and you can be paralyzed by inactivity, you can be paralyzed by, trying to figure out how to deal with all of these multitudes. And I thought that framing of it was really powerful and really helpful for me. And it actually, I think, will galvanize people to look more broadly and not just at our own experience, but at the experiences of other people who are suffering as well.
Thank you, Hoon. That was beautifully put and such an important point to make. I think those of us involved in telling Asian American stories, one of the deep understandings that we have is that elevating our stories carries with it this opportunity and responsibility to understand how it connects us to everyone's story. So now we're going to take some questions from our audience who are watching live on Facebook and YouTube, and I'd like to throw out this first question. It is, in a sense, a detailed question, so maybe we'll probably start with Erika on this. How is it that the Chinese Exclusion Act was able to circumvent the 14th Amendment to the Constitution?
It didn't really, and I know that one of the stories that the Exclusion Act tells is the life history of Wong Kim-ark. So the Exclusion Act bars Chinese laborers and it prohibits Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. The 14th Amendment, which guarantees birthright citizenship to all persons born in the United States, what became intertwined with the Exclusion Act as anti-Chinese activists and lawmakers and others really tried to push the boundaries of exclusion far beyond preventing new people from coming in, but also forcing and expelling Chinese who are already in the United States, and then circumscribing the rights of Chinese Americans in the United States. So the Wong Kim Ark case is a Chinese American who was left the United States for China to visit his parents, as any good Chinese son should do. And then when he was trying to return to the United States, immigration officials attempted to deny him re-entry into the land of his birth. Wong Kim Ark fought back, hired lawyers, sued the government. The federal district court ruled in the 1890s that the 14th Amendment did indeed protect his rights as a US citizen, validated his citizenship, and affirmed his right to re-enter the land of his birth. The US government actually appealed that decision, and Wong Kim Ark was forced to go to the US Supreme Court. In 1898, the Supreme Court did rule in his favor, not unanimously, though. It did rule in his favor, and that ruling, which guaranteed birthright citizenship for Wong Kim Ark, but also all persons born in the United States, regardless of the citizenship status or the immigration status of their parents, allowed all of us to be clearly identified as US citizens. So it's not just what that 1882 law did, but it's also how it helped to justify and legalize and spur on even more acts of discrimination that impacted not only new immigrants, but also immigrants already in the United States and Chinese American citizens.
Yeah, I just want to add that, so much of the cases in the 19th century were based on the 14th Amendment. And for me to understand that, well, how did 14th Amendment come about? It's through African American civil rights fighters during Reconstruction, post-Civil War. And so, as we were talking about earlier, how we are all interconnected, how, our efforts are efforts for humanity, for all of us. And I think that is something that we constantly need to be cognizant of and reminded of, because so much of the time, wedges are placed between groups, community groups, for people to stay in control and in power. But, that is something we need to remember and fight, sort of how Hoon put it so well earlier.
Yeah, thank you, Li Shen. We have a number of questions about that K12 environment. I think we've struck a chord. And I guess I just want to add that public media and a program like American Experience has been so vital and so important to introduce these ideas. And public media has PBS Learning Media, which is a very rich resource for education materials and curriculum. And I think there is tremendous recognition that we have to find our way out of this through deeper understanding of one another's stories and through how we educate the next generation of Americans. Hoon, as a creative person, this is going to be a bit of a departure, but it is always wonderful to have an actor in our midst. Someone wanted to go a little deeper into your own experience and story, and they're referencing David Henry Hwang's rewriting of Flower Drum Song. So as we know, a musical originally based, in a sense, on that stereotype of the model minority, and and what Mr. Huang was trying to do to give us a more fleshed out kind of depiction of the Chinese American experience. I wonder if you have a little bit to say about forming your character in that and what the experience of that play was like. Sure.
That character's name was also Chow, which is the name of my warrior character. But he functions in the story in the sort of more traditional musical theater genre as the jilted lover, so to speak. But in the context of this Asian American story, he is also representative of what some might argue is sort of a rejection of the past, or the sort of frustration of living in the United States as somebody who is struggling to sort of get ahead and is working close to other characters in the story who are sort of forging this not this hard one, but what in his eyes is sort of this glamorous, successful sort of experience. And I thought he was a really, I felt very lucky to play him, because that's been the sense that I've gotten from a lot of people, that there's a sort of resignation to the fact that you're not going to get a fair shake. What I think is most important about any of these works is not that you put forth some sort of altruistic message, but that you are trying to create characters that feel human, that feel three-dimensional, so that the totality of an experience can resonate with someone. If that happens, when that happens, people form their own connections. People find their own way to reach that character and let that character inside of them. That's what's so powerful about it. I got to say, like in the midst of all of these things that have been going on, all of these terrible things that feel like they have such import, I've never been more convinced that what I'm doing for a living is worthwhile. Because I remember when I was, I'll try to keep this short, but I remember when I was not successfully learning French in high school, I was told that the French didn't have a word for cool. And I thought that was fascinating, that there was a sort of ineffable quality about the American version of the word cool. And I feel that way a little bit about the portrayals of people of color or ethnicity in film and television, where there's something ineffable about a powerful character that people just take on board and they carry with them. And it can cut across a lot of intellectual lines. It can cut across the way they were raised. It can cut across the evidence that they see or feel, or any hatred they've been raised with. If they find that person, they find that character, it somehow speaks to them at a human level that exists, that doesn't follow any of those more difficult rules. And so I feel like for David's piece, both there and in all of his work, really, that I think is the major effort going forth, is to simply create people and allow those people to live and allow those people to connect with the audience. And I think that that's the best thing we can do, rather than working in a reactive way against the stereotypes that are fundamentally stood up by other people, right? We end up playing a game that someone else has set up, right? We don't have to play that game. There are people that are going to fit what other people think of as the stereotype of Asians, because that's being human. The question is not whether any of us do that or none of us do that. The question is that a person? Is that something you understand? Is that something that is familiar to you? And if those things happen, I think we get a lot further. And especially with children, I think we get a lot further. And so I don't know if that answers the question at all, but.
No, that was beautiful. In fact, it gets us to our final questions with one another as we're drawing our conversation today to a close. And I was going to ask each of you what your thoughts on that sort of one thing we can do to stop Asian hate. And Hoon, I don't know if you would care to elaborate more, but we'll go around this, but I thought that was incredibly eloquent about understanding the humanity in one another as really one of those responses. But Erika, I wonder if you would sort of take on what's your kind of thought about what we can do in this moment.
There's so much. First, this conversation has been so important. So I think more conversations with a wide variety of of voices is really one of the things that should continue. Events that continue to connect our past, not as these capsules of history that exist in a vacuum and that you learn about, you think it's interesting, and then you put it back on the shelf as if it has nothing to do with what's happening today, but rather making those important connections to our contemporary conditions, as well as to the other histories and struggles of other communities. I think this is where certainly we have had so many convergent crises during this past year and into 2021. But the other thing that has happened is a much greater understanding of how much we literally depend on one another, and how the politics of division, the politics of racism and xenophobia do not just hurt the groups that are targeted, they literally hurt us all. They put us all in harm's way. And out of this past year, but also the past several years, I feel that we have seen so much more solidarity, allyship, a much greater understanding of systemic racism, and hopefully a much greater and wider commitment to addressing this issue. So I'm both continuously devastated, but then also hopeful at the same time. And one of these days, I hope that I can just tilt more increasingly towards hope rather than the up and down cycle that I've found myself in. But certainly conversations like these give me hope, and I'm so grateful to be part of it.
Thank you very much, Erika. Yeah. And Li-Shin,
go ahead.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree full-heartedly, and the only way I know is to continue to tell story and to dig into historical stories, because as Erika was indicating, nothing that happens to us now happens in isolation. There is a history, a trajectory, past to present, back and forth, and the more we understand that, the more we can have deeper, fuller conversations for understanding mutuality, finding mutuality between all communities. And I'm working on a project now that is about plague, that the bubonic plague that took place in San Francisco in 1900. Again, another situation where Chinese were targeted, were blamed and finger pointed, scapegoated. So much similarities to what we have been experiencing this past year. But so it's understanding, fighting back, speaking up, as then there were two cases where once again, the 14th Amendment was used to, by the Chinese, fighting in the courts for their rights in that situation. But I just wanted to say, there's a book by Marilyn Chase, and she ended the book by one of the doctors was asked by a plague sufferer, what happens? I mean, this is, and I would replace the word plague with hate. The quote is that plague leaves severe traces on the human heart, and it may never be the same. And I think that is true with hate. And so we need to just remember that, remember our mutual humanity, and, speak up, have conversations, and stand up for each other. And the only way I know how to do that is from telling historical films.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Li-Shin. And thank you, Erika and Hoon, and to everyone out there for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to encourage you to watch the full film tomorrow evening on the World Channel at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, or stream it on AmericanExperience.org. And now here's Cameo George with closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us today for this important and timely conversation. The Chinese Exclusion Act is available to stream in full on AmericanExperience.org. You can watch any of our virtual conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you liked what you saw today, please go ahead and hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter to keep up with all of our virtual conversations. Thank you again. Have a wonderful night.